Last class, we discussed characteristics of the message and the messenger that influence how persuasive we find a communication. Today, we are going to focus on the audience. What qualities of individuals make us more or less likely to find a communication persuasive, and how do advertisers, politicians, and others capitalize on these tendencies to get us to buy their products or vote for their candidates? Think back to a time when you were in a room with a group of people who held differing political attitudes while watching something controversial on TV, such as a political debate. At the end of the debate, it may have seemed clear to you that a particular candidate, probably your candidate, performed quite well, maybe even crushing her opponent. You were surprised to hear some of your friends discussing how, in their opinion, the opposing candidate dominated. Were you in the same room? Were you really watching the same screen? As it turns out, our political predispositions, and for that matter, our predispositions about many things beyond politics, can influence how we hear an incoming message. Your book references research that shows that liberals and conservatives are influenced by different types of messages. But the research goes even beyond this short statement in your book. It turns out that we process information in totally different parts of our brain, depending upon whether we are predisposed to agree or disagree with the content of the communication. Neurological researchers have designed a series of studies looking at something called cognitive affective integration. Think for a moment about what that term means. Cognitive means thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. We do most of our cognitive processing in the frontal lobes of the brain. Affective means emotional. Affective or emotional information is processed in an almond-shaped part of the brain near the middle of your head, part of the limbic system called the amygdala. The amygdala processes primarily positive emotions, while something called the nucleus accumbens processes negative emotions. Cognitive affective integration is the integration of the emotional information from the amygdala and nucleus accumbens with rational processing from the frontal lobes. These are the parts of the brain that were cut off from one another in Phineas Gage, the railroad guy back in the 1800s, who survived having a tamping iron driven through his head. When Phineas Gage's amygdala was cut off from communication with his cortex, this formerly calm and reasonable man became uncontrollably emotional. Thus, Phineas Gage was the original case study for cognitive affective integration, an area of neuroscience that we just now have the technology to map with accuracy. That was a nice little detour into neuroscience, but how does it relate to social psychology? And particularly, how does it relate to how we process persuasive messages? This is where it gets really interesting. Neuroscientists recruited subjects who were either politically liberal or politically conservative. They placed the participants in an MRI machine and set them up with a series of political advertisements on video goggles. Results showed activity in the amygdala, the emotional center, while viewing commercials for candidates with whom participants already agreed. Activity in the frontal cortex, the reasoning center, for candidates with whom they disagreed. Researchers hypothesized that subjects were activating reasoning centers to develop counter-arguments for commercials with which they disagreed, while responding emotionally to those with which they agreed. Subsequent studies have identified similarly intriguing trends. In a 2004 study, researchers recruited 30 adult men who described themselves as committed Republicans or Democrats. The men, half of them supporters of President Bush and the other half backers of John Kerry, sat in an MRI machine and considered several statements in quick succession. The first was a quote attributed to one of the two candidates, either a remark by Bush in support of Kenneth Lay, the former Enron chief, or a statement by Mr. Kerry that Social Security should be overhauled. Moments later, the participants read a remark that showed the candidate reversing his position. The quotes were doctored for maximum effect, but presented as if they were factual. The Republicans in the study judged Mr. Kerry as harshly as the Democrats judged Mr. Bush, but each group let its own candidate off the hook. After the participants read the contradictory comment, the researchers measured increased activity in several areas of the brain. They included the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and another area called the cingulate, which activates when the brain makes judgments about forgiveness, among other things. Also, a spike appeared in several areas known to be active when people feel relieved or rewarded. The cold reasoning regions of the brain were completely quiet. Bottom line here is that we process information differently when we are predisposed to agree with what is being said than we do when we disagree. Furthermore, an astounding amount of this processing is emotional rather than rational. So, When you and your friends are watching those debates together, maybe you really are viewing two entirely different things, or at least processing it in very different ways. Ways which almost certainly make it difficult for us to really process information that conflicts with our pre-existing tendency to view the world through our own political predispositions. Political arguments aside, we can all be pretty easy to persuade in other ways. Robert Cialdini, who graduated from our own UNC Chapel Hill and the author of several books on influence, has identified Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence. His 6 weapons are commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, authority, reciprocation, and scarcity. Let's start with commitment and consistency. When we read the chapter on social cognition, we will learn that most people strive to keep their attitudes in line with their behaviors. If they are not, people experience an uncomfortable tension called dissonance. For example, if we are reminded that we are generous people, and we are, aren't we? We are more likely to donate to a charity. Similarly, when we make a commitment to something, we feel internal pressure to meet that commitment. For example, every year I receive a phone call from a particular charity reminding me that I have helped them in the past and they are sure I want to support them again, and asking me to make a personal door-to-door appeal to my neighbors to help in kind. Despite my knowledge of social psychology, if I am caught in a weak moment, I find their appeal very difficult to turn down. Why? Because it appeals to my sense of consistency and commitment. I've helped them in the past, how could I not do so again? Social proof plays on our tendency to look at others to suggest to us what is correct. Sometimes called the bandwagon effect, this is our tendency to follow the crowd, because all those people might be right. Consider the success of Like Us on Facebook advertising campaigns. If all your friends like this product, shouldn't you? That, of course, takes us to liking. We are most persuaded by people we like. Give us a friendly sales clerk who compliments our fashion sense or our knowledge of electronics, and whoa, here we go, putty in their hands. Give us someone with whom we don't find a personal connection, and we are much harder to influence. Then there's authority. In most societies, people are taught to respect authority figures, but our tendency to listen to authority goes beyond teachers and police officers. Authority takes on different forms in different situations. Consider the advertisement for Newegg with the logo, Ask a Geek. In the world of complex technologies, where we may feel inexpert, the knowledge that we have an expert or an authority on our side goes a long way to persuade us to buy. Tell us with an authoritative sign that this is the world's best cup of coffee, and we might just have to give it a try. Reciprocation refers to the idea that we are going to give something and get something back. Consider those sales where if you spend $50, you get an extra 10% off, or the subtle influence of the complimentary sample in the grocery store. Have you ever picked up a product just so the sample lady wouldn't feel bad? And finally, there's the old scarcity ploy. Limited time offer, only 2 more remaining. So, how do we protect ourselves? Is there anything we can do to resist being persuaded to buy stupid stuff while simultaneously making ourselves more open-minded to rational arguments about things like politics? Let's go with resistance first. This is not the Borg. Resistance is not futile, but it does require constant vigilance. Here are some strategies. Forewarning is effectively giving ourselves a heads up that we are about to receive messages trying to persuade us. Forewarning allows us to build up our resistance first so that we can more effectively resist. If you know in advance that the store you like at the mall will attempt to induce you with impulse buy items at the register, you can prepare yourself before you get to that point. If you do your homework before you go to buy a car or a new computer, you are less likely to be swayed by a likable and persuasive salesperson. Sometimes we work so hard to build up resistance to a persuasive message that it can have a boomerang effect, making us believe the exact opposite of what the source intends. This occurs frequently with parents and children. Have your parents ever disapproved of someone you were dating? Chances are you expected this, and you built your defenses so strongly that you ignored everything they said and even liked the person more. This boomerang effect is known as reactance, and is as much a response to social influence as being persuaded to buy something you don't need because of clever advertising. Reactance explains why anti-smoking and anti-drinking campaigns often backfire. Reactance also explains why my 13-year-old is so drawn to video games with "for mature audiences only" labels. The best defense against reactance is simply to recognize it for what it is and to force yourself to think critically about the merits of the argument rather than your gut-level defensive responses. Inoculation is just what it sounds like. We use vaccines to inoculate ourselves from influences, and we sometimes want to inoculate ourselves to build up resistance to persuasive messages. To inoculate a person against persuasion, we expose them to weak versions of the argument we expect them to encounter. They develop strategies to counter the argument and gradually build up an immunity to it, just like a vaccine. Research by McGuire and Pappa-Georges shows that inoculation approaches were more effective than forewarning in developing resistance. For example, defense attorneys might say to the jury, "The prosecution will try to convince you that one 130-pound man is capable of carrying a 300-pound steel safe 200 yards on his own in the middle of the day undetected." The prosecution may have several strong arguments, but the defense wants to point out the weakest part so that jurors build up a resistance to the prosecution's arguments before stronger evidence is exposed. We can be quite difficult to persuade when we think we know all the answers. Consider the responses of partisan thinkers to political advertising, or the concept of resistance. At the same time, we can be amazingly easy to persuade in subtle ways, as reflected in Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence. While we will never be immune to social influence, and probably don't want to be entirely so, our best defense is awareness, constant vigilance, and critical thinking.